The Subcommittee on Elections of the Committee on House Administration will now come to order. Let me say good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so very much for joining us today. As we begin, I want to note that we are holding this hearing. We're holding it remotely and in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to Resolution 8. Generally, we ask any committee members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to limit background noise. Members will need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Witnesses will also need to unmute themselves when recognized for their 5 minutes or when answering a question. Now, my friends, please keep your camera on at all times. I know it's tempting at times, but please keep your camera on at all times. Even if you need to step away for a moment, please do not leave the meeting or turn your camera off. That's very important. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made a part of the record. I hear no objections, therefore it is so ordered. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to examine barriers to the ballot faced by voters in the great state of Texas. We have an informative discussion planned. However, I have been notified within the last few minutes that voting on the House floor has now begun. For that reason, and for that reason only, we will need to recess this hearing until approximately 4:30. We will now recess until 10 minutes. Here's the way we're going to do it. We will recess until 10 minutes following the beginning of our last vote, which is estimated to be in the vicinity of 4:30 p.m. I'm sorry for this, but we're going to have to go to the floor to vote. The subcommittee is in recess. First, voters in Texas went to the polls for the first election since the enactment of Texas Senate Bill number 1. SB 1, as it's called, was a sweeping set of changes to the state's voting laws, passed in the wake of record voter turnout in the 2020 election. These newly enacted changes created several new barriers to the ballot for voters and constraints on election workers. While proponents claim that, despite no evidence of fraud in Texas's elections, they said that the law was needed to promote integrity in the Texas elections. The evidence of this month's election shows that, in fact, the law actually disenfranchised thousands of Texas citizens. In a state that already has significant restrictions on mail-in voting prior to the passage of SB 1, reports show that in just 16 of the state's largest counties, more than 18,000 mail-in ballots were rejected, the majority of which were rejected for failing to comply with the new ID requirements placed on mail-in ballots imposed by SB 1. In addition to imposing burdensome new requirements on mail-in ballot applications and ballots, SB 1 created new barriers for election officials, barring them from sending mail-in ballot applications to voters unless they requested one, even if the voter had voted by mail-in ballot in prior elections, and making it potentially a criminal offense for elections officials if they do so. The law also prohibits the implementation of innovative opportunities to vote, such as drive-through voting and 24-hour voting, methods of voting that help meet voters where they are in their daily lives and provided greater access to the ballot in the 2020 election. In addition, the law further empowers partisan poll watchers and sets new rules and criminal penalties on voter assistance. That's disappointing. Prior to the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County, the state of Texas was required to seek preclearance for any changes to its voting laws, such as SB 1. A fully functioning Voting Rights Act preclearance process just may have prevented the disenfranchisement of thousands of Texas citizens. Furthermore, the House passed For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, would have enacted national standards of ballot access, such as no excuse absentee voting and uniform notice and cure periods and same-day voter registration, and prohibited the banning of 24-hour voting, as well as enacted protections for election workers. For democracy to truly serve the American people, every single eligible voter must be able to cast a ballot and have that ballot counted. And so I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the barriers faced by voters in Texas, and continuing to work with my colleagues to ensure that every voter, every single voter, Democrat, Republican, independent, or otherwise, every single voter can cast their ballot. Thank you for listening. I'm now going to recognize my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Stile, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding today's hearing on the important issue of competent election administration. Not even a year ago, the committee held a hearing called, quote, Voting in America, the Potential for Polling Place Quality and Restrictions on Opportunities to Vote to Interfere with Free and Fair Access to the Ballot. At the hearing, the Democratic majority called the brand new Harris County, Texas Elections Administrator, Isabel Longoria, as a witness, presenting her as an expert on elections administration. The majority has been attempting to ram through H.R. 1, a national takeover of our election system. However, they have not failed not only to confer on this bill with state and local elections administrators, but the majority didn't even call a witness of a single person who had actually administered an election, rather than just about it. So the majority called Ms. Longoria. The only problem? Ms. Longoria had no real experience with elections administration. In fact, when I asked her if she had ever administrated an election, she testified, quote, "No, everyone's got to start somewhere," end quote. So to be clear, at the point she sat before this subcommittee as the Democrats' so-called expert on elections administration, she had never administered an election. Yet the Democratic county judge, and that's Texan for county executive for those of us from the north, and a Democrat majority on the county commissioner's court appointed Isabel Longoria, a partisan Democrat activist with no experience, as Harris County's first ever elections administrator. So it came as no surprise that in March 2022, weeks ago, primary elections in Harris County were, to quote one of our witnesses today, Ms. Siegel, and quote, unmitigated disaster, end quote. The hearing title from a year ago was, again, the potential for polling place quality and restrictions on opportunities to vote to interfere with free and fair access to the ballot. Well, it seems like that is what was delivered in Houston 2 weeks ago. As we'll hear in testimony, many polling locations didn't open for over 5 hours. Some never received equipment. Others received broken equipment. Numerous races were left off ballots because the wrong size paper was used. Some voters were given the wrong ballots. The count finished late and only was completed after a court order. And 10,000 ballots were misplaced. It's clear to me that the Harris County experienced an elections disaster brought on through the sheer incompetence and inexperience of an outgoing Democrat hand-selected elections administrator who since announced her resignation but won't leave until she's administered several more elections this year. But don't take my word for it. The editorial board of the Houston Chronicle agreed, writing an editorial entitled, quote, "Sorry, Democrats, Republicans aren't to blame for Harris County election woes," end quote. And I asked unanimous consent to enter this editorial article into the record. The editorial goes on to say, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The editorial goes on to say, Democrats regularly accuse the GOP of undermining confidence in our elections by, among other things, curbing voter access, perpetuating fraud myths. But this week, referring to this election, this week, the Democrats officials running Harris County elections didn't need any help sowing distrust in a sacred democratic process. They did it all by themselves, end quote. Some will ignore the facts on the ground and try to blame efforts by the Texas legislator to bolster voters' confidence in election systems and outcomes. The fact is that the reconciliation sheets newly required by Texas SB1 are the only reason that Harris County discovered, with the help of the Secretary of State's office, that Harris County had misplaced 10,000 primary election ballots. Should today's hearing be focused on the benefits of SB1? Maybe. What happened in Harris County during the primary election was a travesty and should never happen again. But it was incompetence by an unelected, partisan Democratic elections administrator that negatively impacted voters all across Harris County, and that's a fact. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses if they agree, as reported in the Houston Chronicle, with Harris County Democratic Chair that further investigation is needed, or Mr. Siegel's call for and Ms. Siegel's call for independent oversight over the approaching May runoffs in municipal elections, giving Ms. Longoria's delayed resignation. Republicans believe every eligible voter who wants to participate should be able to cast a ballot, and that every vote must be counted according to law. That's not profound or frankly partisan. It's the bedrock of the system of our government. And I hope that the next Harris County elections administrator takes the steps necessary to ensure this goal is realized for all voters of the county. I remain concerned of the Democrats' goal to implement a federal government takeover of elections. I look forward to our hearing today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you to the ranking member, and just thank you so much for your friendship. I look forward to the hearing today and continuing to work with you in the remaining months of this session. In just a moment, I will introduce today's witnesses, but before I do so, as a simple reminder to our witnesses, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes. There is a timer on your screen. Please be sure you can see the timer and are mindful of the 5-minute time limit. Your entire written statements will be made part of the record, and the record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional materials to be submitted. Welcome to each of our witnesses. Joining us today is Hani Mercer. Hani is of the Texas Civil Rights Project. Also, Judge Andy Brown. Judge Brown is a Travis County judge, and I have a special affinity for judges, having served in my state as a judge for 15 years. So welcome to the judge and to the other witnesses. The other witness is Nina Perales of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Joining them will be Gary Bledsoe. Gary is a member and a leader of the Texas NAACP. And finally, Cindy Siegel. Cindy is chair of the Harris County, Texas Republican Party. Thank you to our witnesses. And our first witness, Hani Mirza, as I mentioned earlier, is the Texas Civil Rights Project Voting Rights Program Director. Hani joined the Texas Civil Rights Project as a staff attorney. In 2015, has worked on multiple voting rights cases and advocacy projects. Judge Brown is the county judge for Travis County. As a judge, as for the county, Judge Brown serves as the county's chief administrator, is the presiding officer and a voting member of the commissioner's court, and is the emergency manager of the county. Nina Perales is the vice president of litigation at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We all refer to it as MALDEF, where she supervises legal staff and litigation dockets throughout the country. Ms. Perales has worked extensively on voting rights litigation, arguing vote dilution cases and racial gerrymandering claims before the Supreme Court. Gary Bledsoe is the president of the Texas NAACP, the oldest civil rights organization in the country, I might say, has held that position since being elected in 1991. Mr. Bledsoe is an Austin, Texas lawyer who specializes in public interest, employment, and civil rights law. Mr. Bledsoe has also been a member of the NAACP National Board of Directors for almost 20 years. Cindy Siegel, finally, is chairman of the Harris County Republican Party. Chair Siegel was the mayor of the city of Bel Air for 8 long years. She has been an elections judge at her precinct polling location several times. She's also a CPA, and this is the busy season for CPAs, certified public accountant with 40 long years of experience. In just a moment, we're going to hear from each one of these witnesses, but I think we need to yield to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Davis, for any opening comments that he might have. Mr. Davis.
Well, Chairman Butterfield, thank you so much for having me have this opportunity to actually address this subcommittee. But I do want to thank you for your leadership and for what we're talking about today. I wanted to make sure you also felt comfortable that I warmed the seat up there for you till you got back. It's great to be right next door to you. And I do want to say, I know I speak for each of us when I say that we're praying for Chair Lofgren, who leads our full committee, to make a quick and a full recovery. We're looking forward to having her back with all of us soon. And first of all, thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I'm looking forward to your testimony and our question and answer session. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad we're having this hearing. I just wish we were holding it in that beautiful committee hearing room that we have in the Longworth building instead of on a Zoom call. Today's a session day. We are all in town to vote. We should be meeting together rather than calling each other from across the campus. It kind of reminds me of, I had teenage kids not too long ago, and they would text each other while they were sitting on the same couch together. That's not the way that I'd like to see a committee hearing. But I'm hopeful that Speaker Pelosi will soon follow the path laid out by Leader Schumer in the Senate, where tours are operating again and have been for several months, or President Biden, who announced this week that the White House would reopen for tours very shortly. This is the people's house, and the American people ought to be able to enter it. Today's hearing topic is a very important one, as is our focus on the lessons we can learn from the nation's first primary election of this cycle. As we enter into another election year, hopefully one with a greater sense of normality for voters everywhere, it's important that this subcommittee fulfill its oversight duties in a meaningful way. And that's one reason I sent Republican committee staff to Texas at the beginning of this month to conduct fact-finding around the primary election as part of the committee Republicans' Faith in Elections project. I wanted my staff to see how national issues like the impending ballot paper shortage might impact elections across the country this year. And I have to say that I'm very pleased with the good work being done by the Texas Secretary of State and his elections director, as well as by the Election Integrity Division at the Texas Attorney General's office, to ensure that all Texans can have faith in Texas's election process and outcomes. Of course, as we'll hear today, Not every Texas voter had such a smooth experience a few weeks ago during that primary election. And the facts are clear. Utter incompetence by an inexperienced and unqualified Democrat appointee caused the largest elections disaster in Texas history. That's why I'm so thrilled that we're joined today by Cindy Siegel, CPA who leads the Harris County Republican Party. In Texas, the county political parties control the primary election process. And in the larger counties like Harris County, they contract with county government to run the elections. In Harris County this year, both the county Republican Party and the county Democrat Party made the reasonable decision to contract with their election administrator's office to administer the primary election. And both parties suffered the consequence of her incompetence. A week after the primary, both party chairs were quoted in the Houston Chronicle. The Democrat chair calling for an investigation of Democrat Isabel Longoria, and Ms. Siegel arguing for an independent state oversight of Harris County's upcoming elections in order to ensure voters' confidence in the process. Many of the folks commenting on these issues have read about them in the press. Not Ms. Siegel. She lived them. She and her team took calls from voters frustrated that their polling place hadn't opened 5 hours after voting began. She heard from voters upset that numerous races didn't appear on their ballots because Isabel Longoria, a former witness in one of our committee hearings, her and her team used the wrong size paper. They listened to Longoria offer excuses about why ballots wouldn't be counted in the amount of time required by state law, only to deny those comments later in the press. When Republicans offered to assist with the count, she declined. Finally, Ms. Siegel was there when Harris County admitted it had misplaced 10,000 primary election ballots. Hardly a small mistake, but one that wouldn't have been detected, ironically, if it weren't for Texas's new election integrity statute, SB 1. The Democrats like to suggest pretty frequently and with varying levels of hyperbole that Republicans fight tooth and nail to suppress votes. I can think of no greater voter suppression effort over the past few decades than what Democrat Isabel Longoria achieved in a few short hours in Harris County earlier this month. Polls closed, machines missing, machines broken, ballots missing races, or the wrong ballot given altogether. Thousands of ballots missing and found at the last minute. And a count that took 31 hours to complete, and one Longoria completed as quickly as she did, only because of a state court order telling her that the law required her to do so. But with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. I look forward to the witness's testimony.
Gentleman yields back, and I thank the ranking member for his comments, and also appreciate your comments about having in-person hearings. I actually share your sentiment that in-person hearings are the preferred forum for having these important hearings, but I also appreciate the fact that you recognize and you acknowledge that our chair is recovering from a bout with COVID. She will be back in the chair very soon. More than 6 members of the House, I might say, that I personally know are right now today at home recovering from COVID this week. And so the pandemic continues to be a fact of life. But I promise you, Mr. Davis, Mr. Steele, we will be back in the committee room very, very, very soon. I promise that to each one of you. At this time, it is my pleasure to recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Mercer for his testimony. Mr. Mercer?
Thank you so much. It is a great honor to testify before this body. For my testimony this afternoon, I draw heavily from my work as Voting Rights Program Director at the Texas Civil Rights Project and appear on behalf of that organization. It pains me to say that my colleagues, our partners, and I have observed a severe form of voter suppression and mass disenfranchisement not seen in Texas since the days of Jim Crow as a result of Texas Senate Bill 1. Texas Senate Bill 1's unnecessary and convoluted mail ballot identification provisions resulted in 187 of Texas's 254 counties throwing out 22,898 duly cast mail ballots. That number is approximately 13% of all mail ballots cast during the Texas primary. This is a stark difference from the 1% to 2% rejection rate of mail ballots from previous elections. To put that 22,898 number in context, during the 2020 presidential election, President Biden beat former President Trump in Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia by far smaller margins. Similarly, former President Trump beat former Secretary Clinton during the 2016 presidential election in Michigan and Wisconsin by smaller margins. To put the 13% number in context, during the 2020 presidential election, approximately 1 million people voted by mail in Texas. If Texas Senate Bill 1 was implemented during that election and created the same rejection rate, we would have seen 130,000 mail ballots rejected in that election. Stated plainly, the 2022 Texas primary was not a Democratic election. Texas Senate Bill 1 requires voters to provide their state identification number on their mail ballot application and their mail ballot return carrier envelope. If they do not have a state identification number, they must provide the last 4 digits of their social security number. And if they have none of the above, they must affirm a statement to that effect. Whatever number the voter supplies first on the mail ballot application and later on the mail ballot carrier envelope must match the information on the voter's voter registration record. If it does not at either stage, their materials will be rejected. Everything that could go wrong with this process went wrong during the primary election, resulting in disenfranchisement of tens of thousands of eligible Texas voters. Some voters understandably overlooked the new identification field. For instance, on the return carrier envelope, the identification field is located under the flap of the envelope, making it difficult for voters to notice it. Other voters filled out the new identification field with a valid number, but they were among the hundreds of thousands of Texas voters whose voter registration record has not been updated to include all their valid identification numbers. Although Texas Senate Bill 1 also created a process to allow voters to cure the rejection of mail-in ballots and applications, it proved woefully inadequate in saving many voters from disenfranchisement. The ballot tracker website set up by the Secretary of State's office pursuant to Texas Senate Bill 1 for curing was unusable for many voters because it required the same identification information that was missing from their voter registration record to access. As for mail and in-person curing under Texas Senate Bill 1, both procedures are essentially discretionary for counties to implement. Even if provided, many voters who received their ballot back in the mail were unable to return their ballot by the election day deadline. Many of those voters who did not receive their mail ballot back would have been unable to utilize other options given to them, which were to vote in person or fix the problem in person at the county elections office because they were temporarily away from home or unable to leave their residence due to mobility issues, which in a deep irony would have been the reason they were trying to vote by mail to begin with. Since the 2022 Texas primary was a low turnout election, Texans have not yet experienced the full impact of Texas Senate Bill 1. Texans should brace for the full force of Texas Senate Bill 1 during the 2022 midterm election in November, unless Congress takes action. Federal action prior to that time is crucial, given the surge in turnout expected during general elections, the rampant polarization and voter intimidation that Texans now also expect during general elections, the increased threats from local and state officials to prosecute regular voting and voter assistance behavior further criminalized by Texas Senate Bill 1, and no signs that Texas has any plans to fix the core issues with Texas Senate Bill 1. Congress can and should intervene by using its authority under the Elections Clause of the United States Constitution to strike down Texas Senate Bill 1's most egregious provisions. With such a dire situation in Texas, Congress must act now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Our next witness is Ms. Perales. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Judiciary Committee, thank you very much for the invitation to testify today. My testimony will focus on the particular impact of several current Texas policies on Latinos and how these policies operate together to make it more difficult for Latinos to vote. Despite a very long history of exclusion from the electorate and other aspects of civic life, a history that's been recognized by Congress and U.S. Supreme Court decisions, Texas Latinos are registering and turning out to vote in increasing numbers. For example, in November 2018, Latinos cast about 19% of the total votes in Texas, an increase of 5 percentage points over the previous midterm election. About half of the people in Texas turning 18 each year are Latino, so we're really coming into the electorate. However, at the same time, the Latinos are working to overcome the participation gap Texas has undertaken a series of policies that just make it harder for Latinos to vote. Senate Bill 1, which you've heard about, is one such policy. It imposes restrictions on voting, voter assistance, and voter outreach. And in particular, SB 1 criminalizes what is otherwise legal helping of voters and legal encouraging voters to vote. I'd like to share a specific incident from Bexar County, where I live, the city of San Antonio. This voter, whom I will call Mr. Cantu, is 84 years old and his wife is 77. They're both Mexican-American and longtime voters. They applied for mail ballots before the March primary elections, but they received rejection notices from the county elections office. They were very confused because they had both provided their driver's license numbers on the application, which is the new requirement of SB 1. When Mr. Cantu called the Bexar County Elections Office, he was bewildered by what the worker told him, because the worker told him that he and his wife had to fill out new voter registration forms. This is confusing because Mr. Cantu and his wife have been registered for many years. And it was only after working with staff from Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, a local nonprofit, that Mr. Cantu and his wife submitted new voter registration forms and ultimately were able to vote by mail. These experiences happened all over Texas. SB 1 predictably and by design forces the rejection of mail ballot applications and mail ballots when the county doesn't have the driver's license or the social security number of the voter. The only way to fix it is to fill out new paperwork and try again to vote. The problem is that the voters least likely to overcome obstacles are those with less formal education, less access to technology, or voters who are limited English proficient. In addition to the debacle with the mail ballots, SB 1 deprives voters of help in the polling place and with their ballots, to which they have the right under federal law. In Hidalgo County, the community-based organization La Unión del Pueblo Entero, known as LUPE, reduced the number of staff it provided to assist voters in the March primaries because of the new crimes created by SB 1. It is now illegal for a voter to use an assistor to help her navigate the polling place, interact with poll workers, learn to use voting machines, and understand issues on the ballot. As a result, in the March primaries, voters who traditionally rely on LUPE staff to help them vote did not receive this assistance. SB 1's restrictions on voter assistance have a particularly negative impact on voters who are limited English proficient, such as naturalized US citizens. Slightly more than half of naturalized US citizens who are Latino describe themselves as not speaking English well. And Texas is home to close to 2 million naturalized US citizens, the vast majority of whom are either Latino or Asian American. All of these limited English proficient individuals who are US citizens have the right to receive assistance when they vote. Finally, SB 1 is unfolding against a backdrop of Texas's renewal of its voter purge targeting Latinos and Asian Americans. In 2019, after the debacle of the voter purge here in Texas, where a federal judge had to issue an injunction to stop it because it was targeting naturalized US citizens, Texas promised not to do it again. But instead, Texas has undertaken to start the purge once again. In the fall of 2021, Texas made a new list of 10,000 registered voters who it claimed were suspected of being non-US citizens, and once again instructed counties to issue letters. And once again, naturalized US citizens stepped forward and declared that they were being targeted in the purge.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Your time has expired. Thank you for your testimony. At this time, the chair is pleased to recognize Judge Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. Just want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today to speak about what we're doing at the local level in Texas to protect voting rights, to maintain confidence in our electoral process, and the challenges that SB 1 has caused for local governments. My testimony today will focus on things that Travis County has done to protect voting rights and how SB 1 has made that more challenging and has undermined civic participation in elections in Texas. So first, I'm the Travis County judge, but in Texas, the county judge functions as the presiding officer over the Commissioner's Court, which is the locally elected county policymaking and budget body. The county government provides services through multiple locally elected officials rather than in one authority. However, the Commissioner's Court is responsible for making policy and budget decisions, including for other elected offices. So in Travis County, the responsibility for administering the election is centered in our county clerk's office. Senate Bill 1 has made it more difficult for voters to cast their ballots. It has stifled innovation. It has undermined trust in our democracy, and it has chipped away at one of the foundation stones of our electoral process, voluntary participation as election workers, by making the job more difficult while also adding criminal liability to the job. And I just want to get to the bottom line right away. The bottom line is that Travis County received 11,602 mail-in ballots in the 2022 primary that we just had. Despite significant effort by our county team, we saw a 600% increase in the number of ballots rejected because of the criteria in SB 1. Of the 11,602 mail-in ballots, approximately 16% were initially slated for rejection. Thankfully, the Travis County elections team hired additional staff and made 1,200 phone calls to help voters cure those ballot issues. As a result of these efforts, about half of the ballot issues were cured, and the final rejection rate was about 8%, or 948 voters. Compared to the pre-SB 1 2018 primary election, when Travis County received 9,259 mail ballots and only rejected 156 ballots, that's a 1.7% rejection rate. So compare that with 8% this year, 16% before we took it upon ourselves to call voters to try to cure the issues. Election workers help ensure that elections can function. Election workers often fill temporary positions with relatively low pay. COVID made hiring election workers even more difficult, and SB 1 has made it even harder. SB 1 created felony and misdemeanor criminal penalties for these election workers and election administrators. SB 1 created new rules for partisan poll watchers that allows them free movement within a polling location and where ballots are counted, with limited exceptions. It is now a criminal offense for an election worker to obstruct a poll watcher in a manner that would make observation not reasonably effective. It's unclear what that means, and because of that, partisan poll watchers have little guidance as to the limits of their powers. Our election officials have already observed poll watchers interfering with election workers simply doing their jobs in this past election. In the 2022 primary, this caused impediments and delayed the counting process. SB 1 has also sent a chilling message to the disability community by making mail-in voting so confusing and by making assisting a person voting subject to a criminal offense. For example, in the case where a poll watcher with little training on disability might be present, they could think that the assistant of the disabled person is telling the person how to vote instead of assisting the person how to vote. We know that both volunteerism and civic engagement in the electoral process is necessary for a fair, safe, and accessible process. And we pride ourselves with having this spirit in Travis County. We know our community will show up when we need them. With less than 4% unemployment in Travis County, we're relying more and more heavily on the volunteer spirit of our community for our elections. We also recently increased the wages for election workers in Travis County from $12 per hour to $15 to $20 per hour. SB 1 forces these volunteers and civic-minded workers to take on additional personal liability, adding to what is already a very demanding and very difficult job. The 2020 election presented election officials with new challenges due to COVID. Election officials had to come up with last-minute innovations to make voting safe and accessible during a pandemic. SB 1 was a direct result of the legislature targeting these new and successful innovations that we implemented in 2020. We should instead look for ways to make it easier and safer for registered voters to exercise their constitutional rights using drive-through locations, expanded voting hours, and more. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. At this time, we're going to move to Mr. Bledsoe for his 5-minute presentation. Mr. Bledsoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member. Thank you for the opportunity to bring you all greetings from the national and state NAACP and look forward to sharing with you what is occurring in Texas. I come before you in a very serious manner because what is occurring is actually very serious. And I'm so glad that you all are having this hearing because indeed, in many ways, minorities in Texas are under siege. Let me put this in perspective, if I might. What is actually occurring in Texas is that we've had an incredible growth of minorities in Texas. Now minorities are the majority. From being an Anglo majority 20 years ago, now we've moved into a community where now about 59% of our state is minority. And with this growing number of minorities, primarily this last time, the Latino growth, the Asian growth, the African American growth, we see that the conservatives in in our community are trying to make 40% greater than 60%. Let me repeat that. This is all about trying to make 40% greater than 60%. So therefore, we had SB 1 that was actually put forth and adopted this last special session. And in reference to SB 1, I want to say that what occurred in this primary election is just a beginning manifestation of what we're likely to see. With SB 1 and the primary election, I think you've heard so much about the mail-in ballot issues. Many of our units experience the exact same problem or issue with that, where you see an incredible increase in the number of individuals who have had their mail-in ballots rejected. But let me add one other thing to that I think is important to consider. What we haven't talked about is the number of people who sought to vote with a mail-in ballot who just decided to do something different. Many of them did not turn up and vote on election day and return their ballots. There are a large number of individuals who were just frustrated with the process. And so what we know is because of the new law requiring you to turn in your mail-in ballot, that we know these individuals probably and most likely did not vote. And so I think that's an even larger issue. But secondly, I think what we've seen is something that has always been important under the Voting Rights Act that many of us are concerned about, where we've tried to make voting more accessible to individuals around the country. What we've seen here is because of the incredible number of new criminal laws that are unreasonable and that are excessive, that are vague and unclear, that target election officials, we've seen election officials decide, I'm not going to continue doing that. So what happened this session, this election on March 1st, we had a number of election officials who weren't there. And so there were many precincts that were closed. And so people had more difficulty in voting. And so what we have here is the manifestation of what was designed and intended to limit the minority vote. SB 1 is really a four-step process. The first step is to go after the voter and to limit the voting base. You heard what Mr. Perales said earlier. And so there are areas in the bill that allow you to massage and limit those who are going to be eligible to vote. And then the second component is to limit early voting and to limit mail-in voting, things that are really used, especially the early voting, by minority voters by cutting the hours. So that became very clear. Then third, you suppress the vote on election day. You limit access to assistance for voters. You make the poll watchers large and in charge of polling sites. What I must say is in Texas, historically, the law has always been that an election judge has control over the voting site as if they were a district judge. That's changed now. Now the poll watchers will be in control. So I see my time is about to run out, but the fourth process is obviously what occurs after and things that have been done to change how votes are counted. So I think it's really kind of a problem that we're going to encounter going forward in November in particular.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blesso. Last but not the least, Ms. Siegel, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the subcommittee. In the March 1st primary election, the voters of Harris County experienced the worst fiasco in election history in Texas. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. We're here today to talk about ensuring free and fair access to the ballot in Texas, and I've heard much talked about voter suppression. So what exactly is voter suppression? True voter suppression is when a voter goes to the poll and it's not open because the equipment wasn't delivered or the equipment was missing parts needed to set up properly, or the election judges lack the training to set up the poll. True voter suppression is when a voter is given the wrong ballot and is unable to vote for the candidates that they support. True voter suppression is when a voter is given the wrong size paper ballot, unable to, and their vote of 18 to 20 races is not recorded. True voter suppression is when a voter's precinct is coded incorrectly and the voter is given the wrong ballot style. True voter suppression is when over 10,000 mail-in ballots are discovered days after the election, and that discovery was only because of the reconciliation report that was required by SB 1. There was true voter suppression on March 1st, and the blame for it lies at the feet of the Democrat-controlled Harris County and County Judge Lena Hidalgo, and due to the egregious mismanagement by the election administrator they hired. Historically, Harris County elections have been run by election officials who are accountable to the voters, which is how it should be. Lena Hidalgo in 2020 insisted on centralizing control of the election with an unelected election administrator, saying the elections would be more efficient and would take away the partisan elements. Judge Hidalgo went on to handpick Isabel Longoria, an inexperienced political operative who had no election credentials and had never run a large-scale election before. Ms. Longoria, when hired, began immediately tearing down the internal infrastructure of the elections division needed to run fair and efficient elections by letting several people go who had the institutional knowledge on what is needed to run an election in the third largest county in the country and the county with the longest ballot. Ms. Longoria, instead of focusing on performing her job duties as the election administrator, spent much of last year testifying against SB 1 and tweeting, "Kill the bills." Instead of focusing this year on educating the voters, training election workers, and making sure the ballots were programmed correctly and machines that worked were delivered timely to the polls, Isabel Longoria spent her time 2 weeks before the primary filing a federal lawsuit to try to kill parts of SB 1. This is not an example of nonpartisan election administrator who would run a more efficient election promised to the voters by Lena Hidalgo. The one good thing that happened in this primary is that over 357,000 voters didn't give up voting, even in light of all the problems. However, the Harris County Republican Party still has real concerns that if these serious issues regarding how this primary was egregiously mismanaged are not quickly addressed, we could be facing an election in November with catastrophic results if we have over 1.2 million voters turn out like they did in 2018, but this time to polling locations where the machines don't work and voters are given the wrong ballot. That is why Harris County Republican Party has filed a lawsuit requesting Isabel Longoria and her management team to be immediately fired and the Harris County elections to be placed under state independent oversight responsible to the state court system throughout the remainder of 2022 to ensure that the election infrastructure is rebuilt and voter trust is restored. Although Ms. Longoria resigned effective July 1st, the Harris County Democrats are still trying to run away from the mess that they created on March 1st by continuing to blame this fiasco on the voters in SB 1. The reality is that it was Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo, Commissioner Rodney Ellis, and Commissioner Adrian Garcia are the ones who steered the ship into the iceberg, and now they're trying to blame SB 1. Thank you.
And thank you for your testimony. Thank all of the witnesses for your testimony as well. It is now time for questions. We will start with Mr. Stile. You should go first, the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Siegel, if I can. The discovery of 10,000 uncounted ballots, 6,000 Democratic ballots, 4,000 Republican ballots after the election, it's astonishing and it's unacceptable. Has Texas ever had an election administration failure of this caliber before?
No, not at all.
Can you really just briefly explain how these 10,000 ballots were located?
There's a reconciliation report that was required to be prepared by the judges of both parties the night of the election. And there was an over 10,000 vote discrepancy, and they were told to sign it and then just that it would be explained away later.
And why was that required to be done?
That's required by SB 1.
Oh, so it's SB 1 that actually was critical in making sure that these 10,000 voters were not disenfranchised. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so now let me keep going here. I only got 5 minutes. I want to, if I can, yes, no questions here. Is SB 1 to blame for the egregious mismanagement of Harris County's primary election?
No.
What about sending smudge ballots and incorrect ballot styles and sizes to polling location? Is that mismanagement the direct result of SB 1?
No.
How about inadequate election judge training, vacant polls, or double booking election judges? Is that the result of SB 1?
No.
And so let's not forget about the failure to send election equipment and supplies to certain polling locations. Was that error the result of SB 1?
No.
So none of these are the result of SB 1. In fact, SB 1 flushed out the fact that 10,000 voters would have been otherwise disenfranchised. Let me shift gears. Appreciate those questions, those quick answers. Can you explain how the elections administrator is appointed in Harris County?
Yes, she's appointed by a 5-member elections commission that's made up of the county judge, Lena Hidalgo, the tax assessor, the county clerk, and both chairs of the 2 political parties.
Have there been questions of alleged corruption involving some of the individuals in Harris County?
Well, the question is
allegations. I don't want to get into the details, but has there been allegations made in Harris County?
Well, Lena Hidalgo just had her offices raided last week based upon an $11 million COVID contract that was that she pushed through, which is the same thing she pushed through the election administrator hiring.
I think there's some red flags there, at least. Something I would love this committee to look into in particular due to the role of the appointment of the elections administrator. Maybe something we could look further at, Mr. Chairman. Let me continue, if I can. Let me continue on, though. Ms. Longoria testified before this very committee last year, and when I asked her if she had ever administered an election prior to assuming the roles as the county elections administrator, she said no, and she advised the committee that, quote, "Everyone's got to start somewhere," end quote. Were you surprised at Ms. Longoria's nomination for the role of election administrator due to her pretty clear lack of experience?
I was very surprised. Again, we're the 3rd largest county in the country.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I was actually shocked at that committee hearing when I learned that she didn't have previous experience. One, I was actually shocked she was being put out as an expert by the majority on this committee. But then my greatest fears have been realized that somebody without experience running one of the nation's largest counties has led to the failure that we see before us. In your opinion, as chair of the county party and a stakeholder, has Ms. Longoria run the county's election office in a partisan fashion?
Very much so. And as you know, as the party chair, I've seen nothing but partisanship on her part.
And I've seen some of this as I've been reading into this situation in Texas. It sure seems like perhaps Ms. Longoria should have focused more of her day job on election administration rather than engaging in legal efforts to overturn SB1. I remain concerned about the attempts by some of my colleagues to push for a federal government takeover election. I think we need to really dig into proper elections administration, and in particular, some of our largest Democratic-run cities around the nation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you allowing the questions, and I will yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask unanimous consent to enter 2 documents into the record. The first is a written statement from Chair Chris Turner of the Texas House Democratic Caucus, Chair Rafael Anchia of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, and Chair Nicole Collier from the Texas Legislative Black Caucus, documenting how Texas voters were disenfranchised in the primary election. The second is an article by the Associated Press titled Texas Mail Ballot Rejections Soar Under New Restrictions, reporting on the abnormally high rate that our witnesses mentioned of ballot rejection in the primary election.
Without objection, both documents will be received.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we'll get back to talking about the specific topic here. We're hearing a lot about one county, but that's not the sole focus of this hearing. Ms. Perales, last September, MALDEF filed a lawsuit to challenge SB1 because your organization believes it would reduce voter participation and scale back assistance to limited English proficient voters. How has it affected that example you gave of the couple who had to seek additional help was just so powerful to me. But how has the implementation of SB1 affected Latino voters' participation in the election process, and what should voters expect as we ramp up to get closer to the November elections?
Thank you, Representative Aguilar. As I mentioned in my testimony, we know from conversations with voters that there have been problems where the voters were unable to get through the process or unable to get assistance. We're still waiting for the overall participation numbers from the March primary to come from the Secretary of State. But we do have information county by county that voters had problems voting under the portions of SB1 that we challenged. And we didn't challenge every single component of that large omnibus bill, but we did challenge the parts that we felt would make it more difficult for Latinos to vote. So we don't have the overall numbers, but we do have anecdotal evidence that people went without assistance who needed it, and that people had difficulty casting their mail ballots because of SB1's new requirements.
Can you tell me whether Spanish speakers received information in their primary language of choice?
There were reports that forms that people had to use in order to get through some of the obstacles that were put in place by SB1 were only being made available in English and not in Spanish. Yes, we did hear that. So that added another level of a problem for the participation of Spanish-speaking voters.
I was also concerned with the voter, the purge of the voter rolls that you had talked about, and specifically how non-citizens are identified within the law. So can you describe how the law will work and how it would define non-citizens and individuals who could potentially be purged from the voter rolls, and what's the criteria to how they purge these voters?
Yes, so this is a piece of a practice that Texas is doing that is not related to SB1. This is a purge that Texas did in 2019 that it was forced to stop, that it then promised to stop, that it has now resurrected in 2021 and in the fall. And basically what Texas is doing is relying on stale data from the driver's license department, pulling up information about people who used to be lawful permanent residents years ago. Texas is reaching down into the old data, even though these drivers have subsequently become US citizens and registered to vote. but Texas is pulling out old information about lawful permanent residents and then creating purge lists, which it then directs the counties to use to challenge these voters on purported non-US citizenship.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. My time is running low, but I appreciate the testimony and thank you so much for your participation here. This is obviously something that is incredibly important to our role in the oversight of our laws, and appreciate your continued advocacy to make sure that individuals exercise their franchise and their ability to vote. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
And thank you, Mr. Aguilar. This time, the chair is pleased to recognize Ms. Ledger Fernandez for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Butterfield, for today's hearing. You know, I always remember every time I come to these hearings, that's the Constitution that grants Congress the right to regulate federal elections. In fact, the founding fathers were very concerned that the states might take action to negatively impact federal elections. So every time I hear somebody say that this is a federal takeover of elections, I actually say, absolutely not. It's the opposite. It is us, Congress, living up to our constitutional obligation, the same constitutional obligation that we raised our hands in a vow and in our oath to protect, to make sure that our federal elections are open and fair for all voters. So thank you for holding this hearing so that we could live up to our constitutional obligations. You know, and we know that's the truth because in 2020, we saw that record voter turnout. It was referenced about Texas, but it was nationwide. For Latino communities, there was a 30% increase in ballots cast between 2016 and 2020. But unfortunately, instead of celebrating this increased voter turnout and saying, that's great, right? We want more people to vote because that's what democracy is. We saw acts like SB1, which were intended and designed to impact Latino participation. And it's not conjecture, right? We just heard that thousands, tens of thousands of people's ballots were rejected. Ms. Perales, you were describing the negative impact of voter purges on new citizens. And we read in your written testimony that the Secretary of State had refused to provide you with records required under the National Voting Registration Act. So you're being forced to sue yet again. Could you give the committee some color and explanation of what happens when you're forced to sue over and over again? What does that do to the ability of voters to actually participate in every election?
Well, thank you very much, Representative. The fact that we do have to sue over and over again is a situation caused in part by the loss of preclearance and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Many of these practices, and I do believe that SB1 would have been blocked if we'd had preclearance. And that's why the Voting Rights Restoration Act is so important. And then Congress has the opportunity to enact that federal legislation that would spare individual voters, community-based organizations, and nonprofit organizations from having to bring this kind of litigation. It drains our resources. It prevents us from being able to pay attention to helping voters in other ways. If we have states like Texas that serially enact statutes that make it more difficult to vote, and then we have to sue each time in response.
And we have heard testimony before that litigation takes so long so that we might miss an election cycle, and every election matters. And it should concern all of us to make sure that if you're eligible to vote, you shouldn't have to wait till the next election to vote. Is that correct?
Yes, eligible voters should not have to wait out an entire election cycle so that they assemble the evidence that they need to convince a federal court, when we have the much more efficient system of preclearance if it were restored.
Thank you. Judge Brown, we heard Ms. Siegel, the Republican chair, describe issues with the March primary that made it more difficult for voters to cast their ballots, but you're actually in charge of running elections in Harris County. In your view, has SB1 made it easier or more difficult to administer elections?
Just want to clarify one thing. I'm Travis County, so about 160 miles
I'm sorry.
west of Harris. That's okay. That's okay. But yeah, no, it has made it harder. And I think one of the biggest things that we haven't really touched on today is that it was passed, signed into law, 60 days before the election. So there really wasn't a lot of time for the county clerk in Travis County, elections administrators, in Williamson County, a Republican controlled county, others across the state to work out all the kinks. And frankly, that's why we saw a lot of the problems that we saw in Travis County, one of which was our website went down for 40 minutes because one of the requirements was having more cameras filming what happens with the ballots. And that created more bandwidth usage of the website. So that's something that if we had had, a year or more to prepare for, that would not have happened. And so, but I think the bottom line, just come back to look at the rejection numbers of registered voters who are trying to vote by mail. That percentage skyrocketed. And it skyrocketed because of the requirements of SB1, not because of anything any local elections administrator or county clerk did.
And it skyrocketed across all the counties. It wasn't limited to one county. Mr. Chair, my time has went up, but if you would allow me, I'd like to enter 2 items into the record.
Without objection, if you would identify each item.
Yes.
Please. Yes.
I'd like to enter a testimony from the League of Women Voters of Texas, setting out some of the heartbreaking examples of how their members were not able to vote and not able to get their absentee ballots processed. I'd also like, it's both of these are dated March 17, 2022. The second item is from the committee, the CLC, Advancing Democracy Through Law, is the Campaign Legal Center, also setting out some of the issues that the legal issues that they encountered with SB1 and the administration of the election.
Sure. Without objection, these documents will be received. Thank you very much, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay. Let me ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement that we've received from our colleague, Congressman Mark Vesey of Texas. I'd like to enter this statement into the record if there's no objection. Without objection, the statement will be received. All right, it's my turn for 5 minutes, and then we will conclude. Let me start with Witness Mercer. Thank you for your testimony. The state of Texas has runoff elections coming up very, very soon, as well as the November general election. In a general election, my experience tells me that you would expect higher voter turnout than in a primary election. At least that's the way it is in North Carolina. My question is, given the high percentage of rejected ballots in this month's election, what are the potential impacts, the disenfranchising impacts of SB1 in November?
Thank you so much. I think the situation looks dire for November and for the runoff election before that. If SB1, these egregious provisions of SB1 are not struck down, I think we're going to continue to see high rejection rates in the November election, which will have a way higher turnout. And I fear that the number of rejections we'll see will be higher than the margins of victory in local, state, and even federal elections in November.
Thank you. Let me move over now to Mr. Bledsoe. Mr. Bledsoe, as Texas prepares for elections later this year, when poll watchers may be a more prominent presence than they were in the primary, what concerns, if any, do you and NAACP have about the provisions of SB1 that increased protections for poll watchers and the impact these may have on our voters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the problems we saw this last time was that poll watchers refused to wear a mask, and they would invade the province of African American and Latino voters, and they would insist on being near them, and some election judges remove them. And that was a real issue that went all the way to the Secretary of State's office. Our unit up in McLennan County was working on that one, and so that's a huge problem. We've seen problems with really belligerent and racist actions taken by poll watchers in Harris County in reference to voters attempting to vote or being in line, stopping people from giving them water and things of that nature. We've seen just continued problems with poll watchers around the state in a variety of ways. And so what's occurring with the poll watchers is that they now have the authority to do what they choose. Under the new law, they have a right to be close enough to see and hear, and only they can determine how close that must be. So this means they probably have the opportunity to see how someone votes. I don't care what they claim is in the law. And it also is going to give them the opportunity to maybe hear personal private information that they may be discussing with someone who's assisting them. We don't know what they would want to do or to say to someone, but I think this whole idea makes it very much invasive. And the only remedy, all these new laws that prosecute voters, laws that prosecute Good Samaritans who help voters, laws that prosecute election officials, but they refuse to pass the law that would allow you to prosecute poll watchers. So all that you can do now is an election judge can go and get an injunction or mandamus. And, how long will it take to get one of those if you're set up to get one of those? So it was clearly designed and intended to allow the poll watchers to have that authority. And I must say now they're going to be allowed into vote counting sessions and things of that nature
Thank
in the
you.
aftermath. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bledsoe. Let me conclude with you, Judge Brown. I don't want to leave you out of this exchange. Judge Brown, as Travis County looks toward elections later in the year, let me ask you this: what issues posed by SB 1 concern you the most for your county's election workers and your voters, I might say? What concerns you? What keeps you awake at night?
Yeah, I think the thing that we've got registered voters, people who have the right to vote and are eligible in every other way to vote, trying to vote, and they're being told by SB 1, by requirements of SB 1, that their vote is going to be rejected. And as was pointed out, we've had some close elections in Texas. In 2018, I believe Beto O'Rourke and Senator Cruz were within the margin of exactly these increased rates of rejection. The other thing that it does, it really stifles innovation. We, during COVID in Travis County, we had to think of a lot of new ways to get people vaccinated in safe manners. They worked really well. They were efficient. People thought of new ways to let people vote, like drive-through voting, extended hours, things like that. But that innovation and trying to reduce barriers for people to vote is being stifled by SB 1.
Thank you. And thank all of you for your testimonies. It looks like we're winding down now. The hour is getting a little late, but thank all of you for your patience. Thank you to the witnesses for your very valuable testimony, and also my colleagues for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and if that be the case, we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for those responses. And again, thank you for your participation today. And without objection, the Subcommittee on Elections now stands adjourned.